I was an undergrad working in the fishes.
Okay.
Yep.
That's so cool. I didn't know that.
Ready to go.
Yep. I'm going to close the doors a bit.
All right, great. Here we go. We're going in 3, 2, 1.
Hey everybody! Welcome to the first episode of Old News. We are coming at you live from the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. We've got our building right behind us. You may have visited us before here in downtown Raleigh. So we are really excited because this is a brand new series of ours. Basically, once every month, you can tune into this webcast and we will be sharing different exciting research and discoveries from the paleontology field. So my name is Laura Beth Spear and I'm the museum's outreach specialist. I will be moderating this thing. So I'm going to keep an eye on the chat room and you can type in your questions.
About a year.
Oh, about a year.
Yeah.
Okay, so even less than a year. So how long have you actually been studying old dead animals?
For around 15 years.
Okay.
Full-time research in paleontology.
Okay. So what got you first interested in paleontology?
I've wanted to be a paleontologist since I was a little baby.
Really?
I cannot remember a time in which I was not interested in prehistoric animals and just like stuck with it all the way.
Okay, nice. Did you ever have a favorite dinosaur?
Triceratops.
Triceratops? Okay,
is
that's
my
a good
favorite.
one.
Still my
Yeah.
favorite dinosaur today.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Why?
I think it is probably was the last dinosaur, and I think there's something very evocative about that.
Okay.
Last non-bird dinosaur,
Right,
of course, but yeah.
Non-modern, yeah. Cool, I actually didn't know that.
Mm-hmm.
It's really exciting. Okay, so what's new?
Well, today I'm going to talk about two quite exciting discoveries that have happened in the last month in paleontology. One on some animals that lived before the dinosaurs, and one on sea creatures that lived with the dinosaurs. So the first thing I want to talk about is an ancient relative of mammals in a group called synapsids. Are you familiar with synapsids, Laura?
I've heard that word before,
Okay.
but I need a little reminder.
All right, yeah, sure. So nowadays it's very obvious to tell the difference between a mammal and a reptile. Mammals, like ourselves, have hair, we're warm-blooded, we don't have scales, for the most part give live birth rather than laying eggs, whereas something like a reptile has scaly skin, cold-blooded, usually lays eggs. If you see like a lizard, you can say, sure, that's a reptile. If you see a cat or a dog, or even something like a bat or an ape, you can say, sure, that's a mammal. However, when you get into deep time, into the fossil record, it can become a lot more difficult to tell the difference between something on the mammal line and something on the reptile line. Okay. So I'm going to bring up a little picture here of some toys just of various prehistoric animals.
Are these toys you had when you were a kid?
Very similar to the ones that I had. And I was wondering if you could guess which of these, or if you know which of these is a mammal relative and which one. There's only one that's a mammal relative. The rest are all reptiles.
Okay. They all look like dinosaurs to me.
Okay. So I'll tell you, it's this one here. So that is the one with the sail on its back. That's the synapsid.
Okay.
So that is an animal called Dimetrodon that lived millions and millions of years before the dinosaurs.
Okay.
Actually, it's more deeply separated in time from the earliest dinosaurs than you or I are to Tyrannosaurus rex. So way, way back.
Okay. But we came from that creature.
Well, not that one in particular, but
okay.
something very similar to that.
Okay.
So yeah, mammals evolved from all of these early synapsids. And synapsids, they look like reptiles. So if you, here I have a little toy of Dimetrodon
Model?
Yeah, little model.
Yeah, okay.
And so you can see it's very, very lizard-like, has sort of a long tail, scaly skin. So this is something you wouldn't necessarily think is a mammal thing. But if you look at this evolutionary tree that we have up here of mammals, well, of all land animals, really, you'll see that there is one big branch that are the mammals and their relatives, and then one big branch that are reptiles and their relatives.
Okay. So if we're looking at the family tree.
Yep. So looking at the family tree here, so you have the diapsids and the synapsids, and the synapsids are the mammal group here. And so that's all of the living mammals, and then that's also some of these fossil, more lizardy-looking things. And the difference between them is the diapsids, the reptiles, they all have 2 holes in the side of the head.
Okay.
And the synapsids only have 1 hole in the side of the head.
Do those holes do anything?
Yeah, so those holes are the sites of the muscle attachments for the jaw muscles.
Okay.
So these have these big holes in the head to give them a more powerful bite.
Okay.
But all
Can I
this,
feel the holes in our head right
yes, so humans have relatively, here I can show you, humans have a relatively small hole in the head, but yes, it's right sort of behind the eyes on the temple. You can feel it right there.
Okay.
So humans have relatively weak jaw muscles because over the ages, you know, we're more reliant on cooking food and processing food than our ancestors.
Than like ripping flesh
Yeah,
off
we're
animals.
just like using our teeth to like crack nuts and chew bark like Australopithecines, for instance. So we have relatively weak jaw muscles, but we still have that remnant of that synapsid opening on the side of the head. So synapsids, they have this very deep record going back before the dinosaurs, and scientists have been working on them for hundreds of years. But one group has been in the news just recently, this group called Dicynodonts. So
Dicynodonts?
Dicynodonts.
Okay.
So Dicynodonts, it means 2 tusks.
Like pig tusks?
Yeah, so if you look at this guy here,
Is that your stuffed animal?
yes.
When you were a kid?
This was more recently purchased.
More recently, okay.
To show off, so that it has these 2 tusks at the front here. And so these are somewhat squat, pig-like creatures.
So this is a synapsid.
That is a synapsid, yeah. So this is one of the types of synapsids that lived before the dinosaurs. And so, yeah, it's sort of low to the ground. It would have been rooting around with the beak and with the tusks. And most of these were actually, this is close to life size for a lot of Dicynodonts. So
This?
Yeah, so this right here, and you can see my hand. So some of them were quite small. Some of them were, you know, just as big as a mouse or a rat. And then some of the bigger ones, you know, usually around the size of a pig.
Okay.
And so have a slide here also showing a little bit of the diversity of this group and what one of their skulls looks like. So these are 2 different species of Dicynodonts. One's called Dicynodont, the other is called Bulbasaurus.
Is Bulbasaurus a Pokemon?
Sounds like one, but no,
Okay.
it is a real prehistoric animal.
Okay.
And
Maybe
yeah,
it inspired the Pokemon.
or one way or another. But yeah, you can see that these had these big tusks and beaks, and otherwise were fairly squat creatures. So both Dicynodont and Bulbasaurus, these are maybe rabbit-sized animals.
Okay. So, quick question. Were these living at the same time as dinosaurs?
So the ones that I just showed you were not. These are all in the Permian period, which is before the age of dinosaurs. So the Mesozoic era is when dinosaurs lived, and then earlier than that, at the end of the Paleozoic era, is the Permian period. And that ends around 250 million years ago, starting into the Mesozoic.
Okay. All right. So, what is new?
So
Dicynodonts.
the big news, and literally big news with Dicynodonts, is that I just said that, you know, these were rabbit-sized or maybe pig-sized. There's a new Dicynodont that was discovered in Poland recently that was much larger than that. So in the latest issue of the journal Science, published just a few weeks ago, they found this gigantic Dicynodont. So this is a Dicynodont that is the size of an elephant. This thing was probably 7 tons or more.
He looks bulky too.
Yeah, so this was a hugely massive, robust animal. So they named it Lisowicia bojani. This was named after where it was found. So it was found in a clay pit in Poland in the town of Lisowica. and the species is named after this naturalist who, in the 18th century, worked in the region called Ludwig Bojanus.
Cool. Did you discover this?
I did not discover this particular Dicynodont,
Okay.
but I have dug up and named and described a lot of Dicynodonts in my day.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, and I'm working on more right now. Indeed, have even been working on Dicynodonts from very close to this museum.
Do we have Dicynodonts in North Carolina?
Absolutely, we do.
Really?
So yeah, so there
we
are. Yes, they're sadly have been extinct for a while. But yeah, actually, I can pull over. This is a fossil of a North Carolina Dicynodont. So this is part of the skull and the anterior part of the skeleton. So that's the front part of the skeleton. So if
Okay.
you see this curved part here, this is the back of the skull, and then part of the shoulder blade is down here, and then you can see all these ribs going back, and then the vertebrae. So that's the parts of the spinal cord or the
Okay.
spinal column.
Where was
that's
this
back there.
discovered, this fossil?
So that fossil was discovered just south of Raleigh into Chatham County, maybe a 20-minute drive south of the museum.
Wow.
And there's more material of these Dicynodonts out there. So they actually seem to have been quite common in this part of the country in the Triassic period, slightly earlier than this Polish Dicynodont was living. And so that's another very interesting thing about the Polish Dicynodont is how late it appears in the fossil record. So earlier I said that most Dicynodonts are from the Permian, before the age of dinosaurs. But if you look at this sort of breakdown of deep time at the end of the Paleozoic and beginning of the Mesozoic era.
Geologic time scale?
Yep, this geologic time scale that we have here. So you can see the Permian and then going into the Triassic period. So most of the synapsids, these mammal relatives, were living in this 80 million year block, mostly in the Permian, whereas Lisowicia was living right at the end of the Triassic. So this is very deep into what we would call like the reign of dinosaurs.
Yeah.
And indeed, we know it was living at the same time, even as very large dinosaurs. So this seems to be parallel evolution of very large Dicynodonts and very large dinosaurs at the same time.
Okay. So do you think that is the reason this Dicynodont got so big? Was because it was coexisting with massive dinosaurs?
It probably wasn't directly competing with the truly giant sort of plant-eating dinosaurs, the long-necked dinosaurs, but it's likely that increases in body size in carnivorous dinosaurs and other carnivorous reptiles may have been driving both the Dicynodonts and the herbivorous dinosaurs to get bigger, just as a way to potentially defend themselves against predators. At the same time, you see some herbivorous reptiles getting covered in armor or developing spikes on their body. So it seems like there are a lot of options that they were taking to avoid these new super predators in the Triassic.
Okay, cool. So if you guys have any questions, you can type them into the chat room. I'm not seeing any right now, but I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the Dicynodonts that you've discovered, in North Carolina, and it sounds like they were in Poland. So they were kind of all over the world.
Yeah, so Dicynodonts, they're known from every continent. So we've even found Dicynodont fossils in Antarctica. So in the Triassic, Antarctica was warmer than it is now, and had Dicynodonts and dinosaurs in it, in fact. Some of my work, I was very happy to see this Polish one described, because last year I published on an animal that I have some pictures of here, represented by footprints from South Africa in the late Triassic. So these footprints, there was a lot of mystery surrounding what actually made the trackways, and I argued that these were made by a Dicynodont that was living much later than anyone else thought, a Dicynodont that was coexisting with dinosaurs. But there wasn't really much skeletal evidence to support that at the time. So now having, for sure, lots of skeletal evidence, Lisowicia is known from hundreds of individual bones, probably corresponding to at least 4 or 5 individuals.
Wow.
So definite Dicynodont, and yeah, they're living very late in the Triassic. So they were probably still around. They may have been rarer than they were before. They probably were still around, in Europe, in Southern Africa, probably North America as well, fairly late.
So you made that conclusion based off of just footprints, basically, that you found?
Yeah,
Fossilized
footprints and some bone fragments associated.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And if we were looking at the tracks again, I noticed that they have 5 toes.
Mhm.
So we have 5 toes, 5 fingers. Are we directly descended from dicynodonts?
No. So we're both synapsids. We both come from ancestors that have 5 fingers and 5 toes.
Okay.
Dimetrodon, the sailback that I showed you earlier, also is a 5-fingered creature.
Okay.
That 5 fingers is the sort of standard number for
so like
most land
lizards
animals.
and crocodiles,
Yep,
they all have 5 fingers.
They all have 5 fingers.
Okay.
You have to go back very, very far before you start getting really weird animals with more fingers than that. So all the way back, more than 300 million years into the Devonian, when you get to basically the transition between sea creatures and then land creatures, when the first fish are hauling themselves up onto land. Some of those have 6, 7, as many as 8 toes. But yeah, that it has been stabilized, or as we scientists would say, canalized, at 5, basically ever since then.
Canalized?
Canalized, yeah,
Okay.
that means when something is fixed in development so that it isn't very variable anymore. It doesn't change much as the animal grows.
Okay. Gotcha. Cool. Well, what do the dicynodonts eat?
They were all herbivores. So all dicynodonts were feeding on plant material, and most of them were probably rooting down in the earth. So they have these big tusks, and the tusks always have wear patterns where they've been wearing down the tips of the tusk that are consistent with them, basically going down into the dirt and sort of scraping it, much like pigs rooting around in the mud today.
Okay. Do we think they use their big tusks for, like, intimidation?
Sure. I mean, some of them may well have been fighting each other. There are at least a few dicynodont species where it seems like only the males probably had tusks, so they may have been like to show off or to try to get mates as well. But at least a good number of them were really eating and chewing with them.
Yeah. Cool. Well, that's really exciting to find such a big dicynodont.
Yeah.
That was living at the time of dinosaurs.
Yep. Coexisting with them.
So, do you have any other news from the paleontology?
Yeah, absolutely. So the other big news of late has to deal with sea creatures, and specifically marine reptiles.
Okay.
So I can pull this over
so not
here.
marine dinosaurs?
So no, so these are, during the age of dinosaurs, there were a lot of different groups of sea creatures that were reptiles but are not dinosaurs. So here, if you look at this, here's what one of their fossils looked like. So this is the skull and paddle of an animal called an ichthyosaur. So ichthyosaurs were one of several groups of non-dinosaur marine reptiles during the Mesozoic era. Their name means fish lizard. They were completely restricted to the sea. They would have, much like a whale, they would have died if they tried to come up on land.
Okay.
They have these long snouts and lots of little sharp teeth for catching fish. And then they have these paddles instead of hands. And these are made up of a bunch of little finger bones in order to, whereas we would have our regular hand, they have it all sort of lodged together to create a swimming paddle there.
So these aren't scales. These
Nope.
are actual bones.
Those are
each
those are
individual.
finger bones, just like in our own hands. So ichthyosaurs, they were first discovered in the 19th century by a woman named Mary Anning.
By a woman. Ooh.
Yep. So
That's cool.
she was well known as one of the greatest fossil hunters who ever lived. So lived in southern England.
What a title.
Yep.
Greatest fossil hunter.
And yeah, so if we've got a picture of her here, walking along the Dorset coast, pointing out an ammonite, which is a type of coiled sort of mollusk, a relative of octopus and squid. But she found lots of these sorts of fossils. So ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, seagoing crocodiles, had an enormous collection of all of these things. But when scientists first started studying these things, they really reconstructed them as rather monstrous types of creatures. So this is a reconstruction, actually the first reconstruction of prehistoric life, called Duria Antiquior, which means ancient Dorset, the part of England where these ichthyosaurs were found. And it shows the ichthyosaur just chomping another reptile's neck in half, and just bug-eyed, looking to kill everything in sight.
It kind of looks like an overweight dolphin to me.
Well, yeah, or kind of like more like sea serpents than anything we might really expect to see.
Do you think that's where they got the Loch Ness monster?
No,
idea?
I don't think so. So
okay. Is that a rabbit hole that we don't have time for?
It will take a long time for me to go through the origins of the Loch Ness
monster.
Monster.
We can talk about the Loch Ness at the end.
Maybe another. Yeah, we can always come back to it. And yeah, so early reconstructions of ichthyosaurs made them look very monstrous.
Right.
And some of them were monstrous in size. So there's one called Shonisaurus from the Late Triassic that was as big as a whale today. So this is an animal
like
around.
A blue whale?
Not quite that big, but like 70, 80 feet long. And so if you put a person next to this, so there is just the skull would have been longer than you or I. The skull would be like 10 feet long on these things. So these were gigantic, and they would have been formidable predators. But they probably didn't look, quite like sea serpents. Indeed, in the late 1800s and the 1880s, spectacularly preserved ichthyosaurs from Germany were discovered in black shale, and these preserved the whole outline of the body. So for the first time, it became clear that they were a lot more dolphin-like than had previously been thought. So they have a dorsal fin, and then they have...
What's the dorsal?
The dorsal fin is up on the back. So just like when you see a dolphin or a shark breach out of the water, the first thing you see is that fin cutting through the water. And they also had not just a long sort of snake-like tail, but they had a fluke or a fin on the tail. And so we now know that ichthyosaurs looked a lot more like dolphins, as you can see in some of these illustrations of them. But
they were reptiles.
They were true reptiles.
And dolphins are mammals.
Yep,
okay.
Dolphins are mammals. But unlike most reptiles and like mammals, we know ichthyosaurs also gave birth to live young. So there are more of these fossils that were found in the Jurassic of Germany that actually still have the embryos or the fetus inside them, and it shows that they gave live birth and that they gave birth tail first, just like dolphins today. So this is a very famous fossil that was found almost in the act of giving birth. It would have died maybe shortly before it gave birth to its young. And so, yeah, we know that these things really were basically not only looking like dolphins, but breeding like dolphins as well.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's wild.
That's really exciting. So, is there anything new about the ichthyosaur? Did we discover a new species?
No, it's about their biology. So it is. I just said that ichthyosaurs they're very dolphin-like in their appearance. So that's what's called convergent evolution. It's when two groups of animals come to look like one another because they're living similar lifestyles. In this case, both ichthyosaur and the dolphin are eating fish and living in the open ocean. And the new discovery with ichthyosaurs has to do with their skin and with what their body is made up of. So this specimen was just studied and published on at the end of last month. This is not as pretty of a skeleton of an ichthyosaur as the one I showed you before, but it's from those same deposits in Germany that has really good preservation such that you can see the whole outline of the body. And what the scientists did was they used a number of techniques looking at ultraviolet radiation, looking at X-rays, looking at chemical analysis. So this is just a few photographs from their paper of all the different imaging techniques they used to look at this preserved skin in the ichthyosaur. And what they found was actually quite striking. So it isn't just skin, it isn't just muscle. There's also an enormous layer of fat in there. So can you think of anything else that would have a lot of fat that lives in the ocean?
A dolphin?
Yep, dolphin, absolutely. Any of the whales. So when you think of whales, you think that, okay, they have blubber. So they need to stay warm in the ocean. And so they have this very thick layer of fatty tissue, fatty, or as we would say, adipose tissue, that is filled with blood vessels to keep it warm and helps to insulate these animals from the very cold ocean water in which they're in. So for a long time, it was thought that reptiles, would not have had blubber. And that, so when you think of a reptile, okay, scaly skin, and then basically like a little bit of muscle right up against the bone.
Right.
Whereas mammals, we have softer skin, we, have bigger fat deposits. But there's nothing physiologically really to prevent a reptile from having lots of fat. And indeed, there are chunkier reptiles alive today. Yeah, that's a gaboon viper, which is an ambush predator that lives in a type of snake that lives in Central Africa. And so it turns out that these ichthyosaurs, they did have blubber, and they were probably warm-blooded. So and if they can have it, then some of the other marine reptiles could have blubber as well. So like the plesiosaurs, which is another one of these marine reptile groups that Mary Anning discovered, some of them also have body outlines showing that they had a lot more flesh on the skeleton than we usually reconstruct them. So these were also probably very streamlined animals with a lot of blubber for insulation. And that would have been very important because, and it solves a problem that we had for a long time, which is that even in the Cretaceous, when there weren't ice caps, Earth's temperature was a lot higher. At the North and the South Poles, it was still pretty cold. And yet we found ichthyosaur and plesiosaur fossils in Greenland, in northern Canada, in Antarctica. So if they had sort of the same body type as living reptiles, they could not have survived swimming in those waters. But now that we know that they had blubber, it makes sense.
So paleontologists probably thought that they had blubber or something similar to that, but this is like definitive evidence?
Well, it was, for a long time, many scientists said that no, they couldn't have had blubber. So reptiles, would not have had blubber. And so, there had been some suggestions, but this is the first like really good evidence that these animals did have it.
Well, that's really exciting. So we have someone who's watching who's actually doing a project on Mary Anning, which is exciting. And she wants to know where the ichthyosaur fossil came from.
This one in particular?
Yeah.
So this is a cast of one of the ichthyosaurs from Lyme Regis in the south of England. This is not one of the specimens that Mary Anning particularly collected, but it's the same species, it's the same type of animal that she found in the 1820s and 30s along the Dorset coast in England.
Okay. And can you remind us where the specimen that had the blubber, where that one was found?
So that was found in Holzmaden, which is a famous locality in Germany from the Jurassic. So a lot of ichthyosaurs are also known from around the world, but historically a lot of them were found in Europe. So most of Europe was underwater for a lot of the age of dinosaurs, and so there is a lot of that rock preserved, a lot of the sediments in these shallow seas that are now, where a lot of people live and mine and try to cut roads through hillsides, and so a lot of ichthyosaurs get found that way.
Okay, so they just are found by accident, a lot of those fossils?
A lot of them are totally found by accident. Paleontologists are always going out to try to collect new fossils, but we only have so much time to be in the field. So if someone's working in a quarry every day, they might find one of these. If construction workers are trying to build a tunnel or a bridge, they might find some of these. So there are a lot of sources for where our fossils come from. We collect some of them, and then a lot of them are just like brought to our attention.
Okay. So we had another question. We haven't really talked about dinosaurs in this program, but we have been talking about where we can find fossils. And Holly's son wants to know, where can you dig for dinosaurs in North Carolina?
So North Carolina has a very poor dinosaur record, unfortunately.
So are they in our backyards?
Not
here in Raleigh?
Not here in Raleigh. So here in Raleigh, we're surrounded by Triassic rock. There are dinosaurs from North Carolina. They're found further east and further south. So out in Greenville, you can get dinosaurs. In the rivers there, down in Bladen County as well, near Bladenboro, there are Cretaceous rocks that yield dinosaurs. But it isn't just that they're on the surface and you can just dig them out. Usually the rocks that have dinosaurs in them are fairly deep underground, And what happens is the rivers that cut through these areas, they wash the dinosaur bones from deep underneath, and then they will deposit them on the riverbank. And even then, it's hard to see them. Usually what we do when we're looking for dinosaur fossils in North Carolina is just collect a ton of mud, and then we will wash it down into a screen or a sieve in order to pick out like little teeth or bits of bone. So as of yet, no one has found a complete dinosaur skeleton in North Carolina, or even anything close to complete. So even just like a few bones together. It's always just isolated bones and teeth.
Like one claw, one bone and teeth.
Yeah, a tooth, a claw, a vertebra, for example.
Okay.
But they are out there, and
we just have to keep doing.
Yeah, you just have to keep looking.
Keep gathering all your mud and throwing it in a sieve. That sounds like fun. I mean, that's what you do for field work, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You just like dig and dig.
Yeah, we just spend all the time going out getting dirty.
Yeah. All right, well, those were all of your questions. So if you have any more, you can feel free to keep typing them in. I thought they were really good questions. Do you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, not especially. But I guess there is something cool about Ichthyosaur blubber that I would like to talk a little bit more about.
Yeah, tell me.
So
tell us more.
There is, I've said all these things about ichthyosaurs being very similar to dolphins and whales. Whales are somewhat unusual in their role in ecosystems. So not only are they important as they go through the water eating plankton or squid, but they continue to play an outsized role in ecosystems after they die. So generally, when we think about dead whales, we think about them how we see them.
I cry when I think of dead whales.
Yeah, I mean, it's always sad because they are such majestic animals.
Yeah.
But generally, like when humans interact with dead whales, it's because they've beached up on the surface.
Right, yeah, we hear about them. Some people smell the really bad dead animal smell on the beach.
Very few whales actually look, when they die, end up like this, on a beach where humans can find them. Most of the time, they look like this, which is they live out in the ocean, they die in the ocean, they sink to the bottom of the ocean.
Okay.
But when a whale sinks to the bottom of the ocean, a whole ecosystem grows up around that skeleton. So there are this very specialized groups of animals that only live on what are called whale falls. So this is a dead whale that falls to the bottom of the ocean. So some of them are just like scavengers that will eat anything, that chew the meat off, chew the blubber off, like sharks, hagfish, and crabs. But then there are also these very specialized animals that only eat whale bones. So here we can see some whale bones. These are the vertebrae, the backbone of the whale. And there's a lot of what looks like red meat on it or something.
Yeah.
That is not meat. Each of those is a worm. It's this worm called...
Like each little red dot is a worm?
Each of them is hundreds of worms, if not thousands of worms.
Oh, it's like something from a nightmare.
It's a worm called Osedax, which is popularly known as the zombie snot worm, because it only eats dead things, and it has this root that's filled with sort of like goo and bacteria down there. And it actually... it and the bacteria break down fat and oil in the whale's bones, and turn that into energy to live off of.
Okay.
So the whale bones are super oily, and they have just so much fat in their body that it lasts for years after they die. And it continues seeping out long after all the flesh is eaten off.
So I think we have a whale skeleton here at the museum that's actually hanging up on exhibit, and I don't know if it's still leaking oil, but I heard that it was leaking oil.
It absolutely is.
So does it literally drop out?
So there is
So we need some zombie snot worms to like eat the oil from them?
So we have several whales hanging in our museum here. The right whale and the sperm whale, I think, are over 100 years old, and they have stopped dripping. The blue whale skeleton is, I think, only around 30 years old, and it was continuing to drip oil to this day.
So give it like 70 more years,
and
then it'll stop dripping?
Then it'll stop dripping oil. But yeah, this oil, it's very, it's very nutrient rich. It's very energetically powerful for these scavengers. So they're able to feed off of these skeletons for years and years. And so some scientists question, well, where did these specialized whale eaters come from?
Right.
Is there a fossil record for these sorts of things?
Mm-hmm.
And for the most part, people thought, oh no, that can't be the case.
They're
because
too small, right?
Because the marine reptiles didn't have blubber, and if they didn't have blubber, their bones wouldn't have been, their bodies would not have been oily enough to support these sorts of prehistoric versions of the whale fall scavengers. But there's a very interesting fossil that was found a few years ago before this blubber ichthyosaur. So this is another ichthyosaur fossil, and it has all of these. This is one called Ophthalmosaurus, which looked like this. This is what the skeleton is. Ophthalmosaurus means eye lizard, and you can see it has a gigantic eye relative to its body. And on its bone has all these little starburst traces. And that's exactly the same sort of trace that you find in these snot worms that are eating whale bones today. So it seems like these whale fall scavengers were eating marine reptiles, and now it all sort of makes sense. So if the marine reptiles did have blubber, like the new fossil shows, then it would have been able to support these types of scavengers.
Right.
And indeed, these scavengers probably first evolved to feed on ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs, and then when they went extinct at the end of the age of dinosaurs, they had to switch over to whales. And it's unknown how they survived for the few million years in which there were neither big marine reptiles or whales, but somehow they made it to today.
So the starburst pattern, that is like the mark of a zombie snotworm kiss almost, or like their root system.
It's the root system, burrowing into the bone of something, if not...
It's kind of pretty.
Yeah, a little bit. It's when the worm's not there, sure.
So we had a question. Since ichthyosaurs, you've said that they're so similar to dolphins, modern-day dolphins, is it possible that they could be more closely related to mammals than reptiles?
So they are mammal-like in a lot of ways, but basically all of the skeletal evidence of like how their skull is shaped, even how their hands and feet grow, are very reptile-like. So these things, you can actually trace ichthyosaur evolution all the way back to the beginning of the Triassic, when these dicynodonts and the earliest dinosaurs lived. And those ones, they are much more sort of lizard-like or crocodile-like. They look a lot more like typical reptiles. And it's only the relatively late ones in the Jurassic and the Cretaceous period that have developed the whole suite of features that make them look like dolphins. So I think there's very good evidence that it is just convergent evolution between reptiles and mammals. Just like dolphins themselves are convergent on sharks, which, we think we can all agree are fish.
Right.
So you have this body type evolving time and time again whenever anything is basically a fast-swimming open ocean predator.
Okay, so convergent evolution, can you explain that in a little bit more detail?
Sure, yeah. So convergence is basically whenever a group of animals, or it could be plants, is doing the same thing, there is generally sort of an optimal, sort of a best way to go about that. Like, for example, if you are trying to chase down very fast-moving prey, you probably don't want to have very short legs.
Right.
So selection operates, and over time, the predator will develop longer legs to enable it to run faster to catch up with the prey.
Like a cheetah.
Yep. Similarly, if you're in the ocean, and if you're in the open ocean, you want, a relatively streamlined body. You want lots of little sharp teeth to catch a fish rather than a few teeth that a fish can swim out of. You want a means of propulsion, so in this case, a powerful tail with a tail fin. So all of these would be very useful adaptations to live in the open ocean. So regardless of really where your starting point is, whether it is sort of an eel-like shark ancestor or a crocodile or lizard-like ichthyosaur ancestor, or even sort of a pig-like whale and dolphin ancestor living on land, the selective pressures of living in the open ocean will all be very similar, and it basically pushes that lineage towards similar endpoints. So same thing also is like there are only so many ways to fly, and for vertebrates,
Right.
it's fairly limited. So a bat extends its fingers through its evolutionary history, and then has webs between them, a wing membrane, in order to fly. Same thing with a pterodactyl. The pterodactyl only extends its pinky finger, but also has that wing membrane to allow it to fly. So
Okay,
yeah.
so even though those animals are not like cousins of each other, they evolved like similar physical characteristics to
Yep.
help them fly. Okay.
So that's the essence of convergence.
Okay. And we had another good question. Can you show us that Dimetrodon again?
Oh yeah, this guy.
Yeah. Okay, so the Dimetrodon
So yeah, we
has
can
that
just
big,
take a look at him.
big sail
Uh-huh.
on its back. And then there's also the dinosaur Spinosaurus.
Yep.
Is there any connection between the two?
So the role of this sail in prehistoric animals has been fought over by paleontologists for years and years.
So it's like a heated
It's
debate?
it's a heated debate, and indeed one that is an apt pun, because it has been argued that it was used to absorb heat from the sun, because these were probably cold-blooded animals. So modern reptiles, they need to go out and absorb sunlight in order to get moving. So dinosaurs and the earliest synapsids, probably not as cold-blooded as living reptiles, but still, not like a bird or a mammal, like really warm-blooded type things.
Right.
So on one level, it made sense. Oh, sure. So if they have more surface area of their skin, with all blood vessels in here, they can absorb that sunlight and really just have the advantage to go running around. So it's a nice story. It's a good hypothesis. But more recent research suggests that it is probably not the case. So scientists have done a lot of histology, so looking at the tissues, cutting up bones, and looking at them under microscopes. And it turns out that the cells of these things do not have many blood vessels in them.
Okay, so that is basically like saying that it was not used for heat.
Yep,
at all,
would not
or
have
heat
been
control.
used primarily for heat control.
Okay.
So the current hypothesis is that it was used for display, that these were somehow signaling to each other using the sail.
Okay.
There was also recently research on Spinosaurus, which now seems increasingly likely to have been a semi-aquatic animal, so it would go into the water. It would have been amphibious. There was a paper suggesting that the sail in Spinosaurus is just to have more bone mass in order to weigh it down and have it sink into the water, which could have, that might partially be true, but I think it's unlikely that that would have been the primary driver to
Okay.
develop such a huge, hugely costly, in terms of the energy
Yeah.
structure like a sail.
Right.
So probably also originally for show in Spinosaurus.
Okay.
But it is weird that basically there are these little pockets in Earth history when all of a sudden everything has sails. So Dimetrodon was living with a very distantly related animal called Ichthyosaurs that was a plant eater that also had a sail independently. There was a type of ancient frog relative, an amphibian called Platyhystrix, that had a sail that lived with these
frog
guys.
with a
Yeah.
sail?
Yep. And then when Spinosaurus lived, it coexisted with a plant-eating dinosaur called Oranosaurus that also had a big sail. So sails, you don't see them often in prehistory, but when you do, you often see a lot of sailed animals together, and it's a total mystery why that is.
So, long story short, the connection between the Dimetrodon and the Spinosaurus is probably another example of convergent evolution, maybe, where they had
Yeah.
a sail and they were using it as...
Yep.
Cool.
Yeah, it's a
Okay.
superficial connection. They're not close relatives.
Okay. Well, you guys had some really great questions.
Yeah, thank you.
I certainly learned a lot. Kind of changed my perspective a little bit about prehistoric animals and what was happening around the time of dinosaurs or before the dinosaurs. So if you have any other questions or comments or suggestions, you can email us at outreach@naturalsciences.org. We also would love it if you fill out a really quick survey. So I'll put the link to the survey and I'll type our email address into the chat room here. Thank you, Christian, for
Yeah.
sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you, Laura Beth.
And thank you guys for, tuning in and joining the conversation. So we hope to see you next time. Our next Old News webcast is going to be Tuesday, February 26th, again at 1 p.m. So we hope you can join us. Thanks. Bye.